Hi students, I'm going to make this short and sweet. We're going to get through just like a very little bit that I want to go through. Congratulations, you made it through another chapter or another period. We're coming to the end of period 6. On this slide, the really only thing that I want to talk about is a little bit of what's going on with big business. So remember how we had talked that big business had like these great big monopolies and this idea of laissez-faire economics where they just wanted the government to be hands-off, except the government wasn't exactly hands-off when they were giving out speculation, and they were giving out money to some of these big businesses and kind of like this idea of kickbacks. So part of that was the regulation of the railroads. The railroads always seem to get extra benefits that the others didn't get. This was part of the populist platform when they said, we want government control of the railroads. So eventually we get to what's called at the very bottom there, the Regulation of Trusts and the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, I'm not going to go through this a whole lot because we will talk about the Sherman Antitrust Act again when we get to Teddy Roosevelt in period 7. But all I want you to really know is that we realized that the government had to do something about these big corporations, these big monopolies who were really kind of pushing out the little guy and taking complete control of the economy. And it led to little competition. We talked about vertical and horizontal integration. And it wasn't very good. Now, part of the issue when they made the Sherman Antitrust Act is that they didn't really explain what a trust is. This was a huge issue back in the 90s with Microsoft. Microsoft got rung up for having a trust, kind of a monopoly, with the whole thing with Internet Explorer. Then later, actually just this past year in 2020, Google is coming up against a trust case where the government is saying you have way too much power and control in one centralized area and nobody else can really get in. So this right here, this video, is a Hip Hughes video that I've embedded. It's probably one that you should watch. You don't have to, because like I said, we will talk more about the Sherman Antitrust Act, but to really know what a trust is, and you need to know about the Sherman Antitrust Act, it wouldn't hurt to watch that video. So the last thing I want to talk about is this slide right here. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. Facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continued to fight for political and social equality. So the first really 5 here are the ones that we're going to get to. We'll talk a lot about Booker T. Washington in period 7. But Jim Crow laws, this idea of Jim Crow laws and the black codes, it was whatever could be done to kind of promote white supremacy. And the Jim Crow laws were really evident all over in the South. We have poll taxes, for instance, where you had to pay money to take a test. We see the KKK being very violent, very intimidating toward people. The grandfather clause. The grandfather clause said that you had to take a literacy test, and I actually have an example. We'll look at one as we go on later in the course. You had to take a literacy test in order to vote. Well, I personally could not pass that literacy test. Like, it is terribly hard. It's almost like a trick test. You have to take in like 10 minutes, and if you get even one wrong, you didn't pass. Well, what's interesting is that there's a lot of like Southern whites who would have never been able to pass this literacy test, but they were grandfathered in. So this idea that if your grandfather was able to vote in previous elections, like before the Civil War, then you would be able to vote too, because there's no way that some of these like illiterate white members of white citizens could ever pass the test, but because their grandfather could. But obviously there's no formerly enslaved black people that would have had a grandfather that could have voted in an election before the Civil War. So this was kind of this idea of grandfathering in. We had literacy tests, obviously, things like that. One thing. So I'm going to talk about the impact of Plessy versus Ferguson, and we're going to watch a Hip Hughes video, actually. He does a really good job of this one. But I also want to show you this idea of really the impact of the KKK when we look at Well, it's called Sanctuary Without Sanctuary. These are actually postcards, and right now they are in a museum. I want to show you kind of the yuckiness of it. Let's see if I can pull this. You know what? To be honest, I'm gonna go to this. There we go. So I'm gonna pause that for just a second. And I'm going to go to this slide right here. If you can see that, that's a man hanging from a tree. The corpse of Clyde Johnson, 1935. This is still happening. These lynchings are still happening in 1935. It was on a postcard, etched in the negative, killer of Jack Daw. So apparently he had killed Jack Daw in 1935. There's another one. So two young boys, we're not exactly sure the time, 1900 to 1915. It looks like from Texas. There's another one, 1900 to 1915 is about when it's dated. It was from Georgia. So what we realize is that these, the KKK and Jim Crow laws and black codes and all of these kind of lynchings and ways to keep Southerners black Southerners from really enjoying full citizenship rights, full civil rights, was very much alive and well. And it culminated in the idea of Plessy versus Ferguson. This upholds the doctrine of separate but equal. We know now that separate is actually inherently unequal. You know, you had to have a separate school, you had to have separate books, you had to have a separate bathroom, you had to have separate restaurant areas, all of these things. The Supreme Court case, and I remember that this is one of on that half sheet, or that sheet that I gave you, the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson upholds that separate is equal. So after this, until we meet again, I'll see you later.
I'm so glad to be here with you right now. I was actually talking to a kid who was in kind of an advanced class, and we were talking about civil rights, and the kid didn't know the separate but equal doctrine. So I came this close to quitting my job and going to go work at Dunkin' Donuts, where I don't have to deal with this nonsense. But nevertheless, let's explain really the foundations of civil rights in the United States. Just in a couple of minutes, really basic information here. So, of course, you know that slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and most people are familiar with the basic concept of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, a change in federalism, giving the federal government really the ability in the future to enforce equality in the states when they're not doing it for their citizens. So, basically, in 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act passed also that kind of gave teeth to the 14th Amendment, saying we really mean business here. And then the southern states were like, screw you, we're going to do it anyway. This is Jim Crow, of course, and this is accelerated after 1877, the Compromise of 1877, which withdrew the Union troops and really allowed the South to kind of fester by itself and do what it wanted to. So by 1896, and now we're getting to the separate but equal doctrine, the Supreme Court hears the case Plessy versus Ferguson. And this court case is in Louisiana. Remember, the 14th Amendment deals with states. So we're dealing with the state of Louisiana, but we're creating a precedent for the whole country. And in Louisiana, they have a law called the Separate Car Act. And of course, this is Jim Crow 101, segregation. They are making black and white people ride on separate train cars. And Plessy, Homer Plessy, actually was, I believe, only 1/8 black. He looked white. He was the test case. He was chosen to challenge this law. And I probably thought that he had a better chance of winning if he looked white. But nevertheless, he's arrested. And then this court case makes its way up to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court says, which is just kind of unbelievably ridiculous, is that although the cars are separate, they still can be equal, separate but equal. So therefore, the state of Louisiana, i.e. Jim Crow, is not in violation of the 14th Amendment. And the separate but equal doctrine is the federal legal justification or rationalization to allow for Jim Crow to fester in all of these states. And of course, segregation in schools and water fountains and hospitals and fill in the blanks in life. And that's because of the separate but equal doctrine. Now, fast forward to 1954, 1955, and we have the reverse court case. And remember, all of this is unwritten, too.